What's up, guys? Let me get my wide shot here. Excited for today's show. I have Stewart Gibson here from Advanced Sports Analytics. I love watching his shows with Blender and sometimes Brandon Adams each week talking about correlations on the slate. I think it's one of the most useful and actionable things to focus on for DFS. So I said, I got to get Stewart on. Stewart, how are we doing, buddy?
Doing all right. Had a good show yesterday with Blender. I think he is a good resource for me to kind of get my head right for the week ahead. Doing some work on Thursday and Friday to prepare our tools and content, and hoping this will kind of further get me prepared for week 13. And also happy to discuss kind of some macro thoughts around correlation, which I know we talk a lot about. Blender and I do on that show, and we kind of gloss over the macro concepts, but I think it's would be useful to kind of discuss the concepts at large and kind of how they can be applied to not only the specific slate at hand, but just DFS slates in general.
For sure. Yeah. So what we're thinking for today is we're going to start macro with, some general ideas of correlation, how it works, what are, strong positive correlations. Then we can get more into specifics. We got screen shares going. Advanced Sports Analytics has a great player correlation app. So later in the show, we can look at a few maybe specific examples of players you guys have curiosities about as far as how they correlate. And then we also have Stewart's Week 13 stack spreadsheet, which I get each week in their Substack and is very valuable for kind of seeing how this correlation fits into the larger picture with ownership in price, which is, ultimately the puzzle piece we're trying to put together here. But let's start right at the top, Stewart. For people, we hear this term bandied about, correlation. I think people basically understand it, but why don't we just start with kind of when you hear that name, how do you describe it to people?
Yeah, so I mean, correlation is a mathematical principle that essentially quantifies how two vectors relate to one another. How indicative is vector A of the value of vector B when paired together. So in DFS context, those two vectors are just players' fantasy points, week over week, and we're able to match up those those two vectors, or probably people call them game logs, for example, and we're able to produce this XY scatter or XY relationship of how two sets relate to one another. And correlation is just a catch-all linear metric. It's worth noting that it's a linear metric as opposed to some sort of nonlinear exponential metric, and it's, I think, just a good way to understand how sets of players interact with one another. Sometimes we have these positively correlated sets that we discuss where the performance of player X is indicative of similar performance relative to player Y's norm for player Y, and negative correlation means that when player X performs well or performs poorly, typically player Y performs the opposite. And then we have neutral or zero correlation, where there's essentially no discernible linear relationship. I'm trying on my screen to find, there's a classic correlation set of scatter plots that just clearly show kind of what but I'm not able to find it on Google quickly. Oh, yes, here. If you want to pull up my screen and we could just look at this image here. Well, shoot, that's kind of small.
You might be able to zoom in on it, and I can go full screen here.
Okay. Yeah, it's just hard to read the numbers.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So, correlation is this metric that ranges between -1 and +1. 0 being essentially neutral correlation or no correlation, 1 being exceptionally positive, where the outcome of X is perfectly indicative of the outcome of Y. A -1 is the same. The outcome of X is perfectly indicative of the outcome of Y, but just in the negative direction. So we can see in this kind of set of scatter plots, we have, if we imagine that this is a scatter of X being, fantasy points scored by, a certain player, quarterback, specific quarterback, and the Y values in these scatter plots are performance of player Y. We have these like zero correlation examples. So I'm looking at this one that's just like a cloud of data points, right? Like, if player X performs to the right of this cloud when looking at it horizontally, it doesn't really give us like much indication as to our expectation for player Y. Player Y could score, is most likely to score somewhere within their norm, with outcomes ranging kind of either high or low, on their relative data cloud. And then we have like one where, it's just perfect. Like if we know what X scores, if we know kind of the horizontal value of X, we know exactly what Y is going to be. Like that never happens in, NFL or really any non like physical science. I think like maybe like, if we were to chart like elevation versus temperature in, some, city or some like, whatever, like that's going to be perfect correlation, but that really never exists like in actual, real world stuff aside from the hard sciences. In DFS, we really have more of these correlations that really fall, and we don't even see correlations as tight as like 0.8. We can see right here where it's just super tight cloud. We really see stuff that ranges probably between like +6 and +0.6 and -0.6, where, even like 0.4, which I consider to be a pretty good correlation, we have this loose cloud that is somewhat indicative and somewhat directional, but, it's still like there's a range of outcomes that can occur within some, horizontal value on X. And then I make the note about correlation being linear. Like we have down here this example, like a W where, there's clearly a pattern and X is super indicative of Y by some, non-linear function, but when forced to draw a straight line through this like W shape or W cloud of data points, it's just a flat line. So, we have that zero correlation. So I think that's useful. That's, I think, like a classic example of, correlation as a scatter plot. Like that's kind of how we want to think about it. And I know our tools at Advanced Sports Analytics we try to, go the route of charting out correlation, not only as a metric, but also providing the underlying data points that produce that metric. So, I think that's something we're aiming for.
No, I think that's a very good bedrock for this discussion. I did just tab over to the player correlation app, and I tossed in Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, two guys who I think intuitively have a pretty high correlation. You mentioned getting up into that 0.6 range, pretty high here at 0.584, and then we can jump over to the scatter plot as well. We have Eric Belair in the chat asking, what stats are you using to compare players? We got it here on fantasy points. Do you find that to just be the best overall tool for trying to look at these correlations?
Yeah, so I think the reason we have the drop down with selection, or really no selection, is that when we designed the application, we did have features to compare correlation between rush attempts, targets, stuff like that. But I think considering correlations works best when there is significant amount of variance in the data points. Like if you have a bunch of data points that have low amounts of variance in them, you're just going to get really, like really high or really low correlations that are, not really a result of, I think, the underlying trend that produces or supports those correlations, but just, a result of, not like, I saw, as I showed in that, the scatter plots, like you're seeing many data points that aren't like bunched together. When you do stuff like rush attempts or like, red zone rush attempts, for example, where, guys are really getting like either 0, 1, 2, or like maybe 3, you're just not having you have a very sparse data set. So I think fantasy points is really a good one to look at, and kind of how we've designed the tool.
Yeah. And so, you mentioned kind of those thresholds here. If people are tabbing around and they see this number here, 0.584, can you give, kind of just some general heuristics for, what's a good correlation? Obviously, quarterback to wide receiver is one of the strongest ones we have, but maybe we could look at a few examples just to give people some kind of benchmarks for what kind of correlations they should be looking for.
Yeah, so I think there's a qualifier that we always need to consider with correlations, and that's the sample size. When we have small sample, if you try to draw a straight line through 2 points, like you're always going to be able to draw a straight line, right? So the correlation of any sort of player combination that only has a sample size of 2 is always going to be -1, 1, or 0. when you have only 3 data points, you'll just see correlations that are extremely high or extremely low. And we expect all this stuff, like we talk about regression to some sort of mean, like that is a phrase that just refers to the notion that, like when a rookie baseball player goes 3 for 5 in their first game, we don't really believe that their true, talent level is 600 hitter. But if they went 300 for their first 500, all of a sudden we'd now be like, all right, this guy might be a 600 hitter. Same thing applies to correlation. Like if we see a set of players who through their first 3 games shows like, negative 8.8 correlation, with the notion that like negative 0.8s like rarely happen for sets of players in the long term, we would expect that that correlation to regress to some more likely kind of latent correlative value. So, an example like Adams and Rogers over the last 3+ years, they have a really large sample. I would say, anything at like 0.6 or even above 0.4 for like a sample that's more than definitely 2 seasons, and even at like a season and a half. So maybe, what would that be, 24 games? Like you're starting to get to pretty high correlations. Now, if you have a sample or a pair of players that have a 0.6 correlation after 4 games or 5 games, I think we might suspect. So like, I don't know, maybe you could type in like Tua and Devon. Well, so Taysom Hill has lots of games.
I was going to set the filter though to like maybe the past 3 weeks with that.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a super small sample.
I would guess you're going to get an error message.
Oh, okay.
Maybe not though. But yeah, I mean, yeah, so you could set it to like, I don't know, 11-1 even 2020. Yeah, I mean, so like to me, it's not like there's really a set like level of like, all right, this is all of a sudden, good correlation and bad. And like, I don't think we should be thinking about these things. Yeah, like 0.871, like, okay, if Michael Thomas and Taysom were to play 20 more games where Taysom was starting quarterback, we would expect over time that correlation to, truncate to some sort of latent correlation that, it might be positive, might be 0.5, might be 0.2, might be like negative 0.2, and they've just been running extremely correlative in the last, whatever, 4 weeks. So, I wish there was like okay, once you get in between 0.2 and negative 0.2, you're dealing with guys who aren't correlated. And once you get outside of those bounds, you're all of a sudden dealing with guys that are highly correlated. I don't know. To me, I think like 0.2 is kind of a good, like soft boundary to make for yourself once you start getting sample sizes up higher. But I do think. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just, one kind of other concept with correlation, because again, like you're saying, this isn't our end all be all. This is kind of a tool to point us in the right direction. And one thing, we're looking for in DFS are these outlier performances. What is the game that goes off? And I know when you guys talk on your show with Blend, you're talking what stack has one of the top probabilities to be the highest scoring stack on the week. And when you get into that territory of highest scoring stack, we sometimes have a piece of the pie that's now so big that it overwhelms correlation to where we could see, 3 guys who are negatively correlated all have a ton of fantasy points. So how do you think about this idea of letting correlation guide us, but still knowing that ultimately we just want the environments where there's going to be a ton of fantasy points?
Yeah, I mean, I think having price sensitivity there is important. Like, the size of the pie, if we think about it as like an implied total, is what it is. But let's just say 55 total pie for or let's say like a 31 implied total for a side, right? Like that's a piece of the pie. That's a big pie. But if that's likely to, be chopped up by, let's say, a quarterback and 2 receivers, and those 2 receivers, like we have with, who are we talking? Thielen and Jefferson, I think, are a great example this week, where it's like, yeah, sure, it's a good pie, and we feel pretty good about how condensed that offense is, but those guys are expensive now. So it's, even though it's a big pie, it costs a lot of money to get access to that pie. If we have a 28 total pie, with a 7K wide receiver. Let's say Devontae Adams, what is he? He's up probably like 8 or 9 this week. And then like, a 5K receiver like Allen Lazard, all of a sudden, sure, we're talking about a smaller pie, but we're also talking about, less salary we need to kind of get access to that pie. And, therefore like per dollar could make sense. We added this combined max column mid-season. I find that to be super useful because it's like, correlation is a trade-off, right? Like, I think a lot of people discuss how when you're playing a totally uncorrelated lineup, 9 different players from 9 different teams, you're hoping to hit, some sort of nine-leg parlay and kind of the optimal outcome really for, 90th, let's just say like 90th, 95th percentile outcome of all these different 9 players. When you correlate, let's say just as simple as you have, 9 players from 8 different teams. One is a quarterback plus a receiver from the same team. All of a sudden, and those 2 players are positively correlated in a way that you feel good about. When you still have to hit an 8-leg parlay, but when one of those legs, when a quarterback hits their 90th percentile outcome, it doesn't guarantee that the wide receiver hits their 90th percentile outcome. Far from it. But it just gives you. Now, all of a sudden, a 90th percentile outcome for that wide receiver isn't 10% likelihood, it's 20% likelihood or 30% likelihood, depending on the degree of correlation. So that's great, right? But the trade-off is, especially when we get to double stacking, 2 receivers on the same team with a quarterback, like there are receivers that positively correlate, but we do concede that there is a cannibalistic nature of pairing receivers together, right? Like if Calvin Ridley catches a touchdown, that's one touchdown that Julio Jones can't catch. That's a drive that ends where Julio Jones doesn't score. And, I think this is like a good example to talk through because these guys have, neutral correlation, I think slightly negative.
Yeah, I just pulled it up here, negative 0.0081 or
right.
0.081.
And so, combined, they have this combined ceiling because they don't have exceptional correlation of, 64.6, right? That's the most points that combined they have scored in a single game. Although we do know that like the ceiling of Julio plus the ceiling of Ridley, like we have our distributions app, which I'm pulling up just to get the numbers real quick. Like Julio has a 95th percentile of 36 fantasy points. Ridley over the last 2 years has had a 95th percentile of 33. So 69. Nice ceiling of each of those guys. But because there's not exceptional correlation, there's just not like a high likelihood of both those guys reaching that 95th percentile outcome in the same game, right? Like,
so basically, yeah, the way you're describing it now, it's interesting, right? Because Calvin Ridley and Julio, like you just said, inherently have a negative correlation. One of them can't be scoring when the other's scoring, but this combined max is showing us what is the likelihood, though, that their game environments or this offense can overwhelm that inherent negative correlation just because of the offense scoring a lot of points. And we're now trying to untangle those 2 competing forces. Is the offense and the capability of it scoring enough to outweigh the negative correlation?
Right. And, if you look at like what that combined max came from in the plot, okay, so this is actually pretty good. The combined max is this data point that exists at like Jones scored 27-7, Ridley 36-9. So that's like an outcome where, it made sense to have both of those guys, right? As you can see, like it's really at the very edge of this kind of cluster of data points. We have some other instances where Ridley and Julio combined for a large max. Like I'm looking at a 1 at the top, and I have Julio. Let's see. Oh, okay, you have my screen. I have Julio at the top. So we have like great. They combined for 55. You can see. Well, I can't hover over. But you can see the second row combined fantasy points 58.1. Like great, but okay, that came from 43 from Ridley and only 15 from Julio. If you could do that over again. Like you don't really need Julio in that outcome. Like this is a combined total of 56, but, Ridley put up 18-9, Julio 36-7. And like, if Ridley, this came, I guess, in early, mid 2020, so mid this year, but, Ridley now is priced where he's like regularly in the sevens, and Julio, depending on if he was injured the week before, is regularly in the high sixes, low sevens. If Ridley was priced down at 5K, this is an instance where it makes sense to have Ridley and Julio, but now that Ridley's priced up at 7, like there's really not much value to having Ridley on top of Julio if they're kind of combined ceiling performance is one where it's just like Julio carrying all the load or Ridley carrying all the load. We do have this example from really the first game of the season where they both hit in a big way. So, that's the thing about correlation. It's like it is a metric that shows like a trend or pattern from the past. However, it isn't perfectly indicative of the future. Even though there is slight negative correlation, it doesn't mean that there is no possibility that both Ridley and Julio can, achieve some massive ceiling. It just means you're like fighting, slimmer odds. And, maybe that's something you want to do. I know in Showdown, there's like a huge emphasis on, being different and unique. And if, all these people are willing to only, want to only build correlative lineups because they're, chasing better odds, then, maybe all of a sudden you say, hey, the trade-off for, low odds of a ceiling, relative to kind of ownership or, just the quality of being uniqueness maybe is valuable. But yeah, I think that's like a really good way to look at it. And I think one of the core columns that I'm paying attention to in our Substack, and you can go, or I can pull it up, I guess, on my screen.
This one here?
Yeah, great. So, I'm looking at, okay, what is the ceiling of a stack? So the way we define it, the way I define it, I guess, in this column is what is the combined ceiling that the receivers have achieved together. And then you have to figure if, Thielen plus Jefferson achieve kind of their maximum combined value that we've seen to date. And granted, with a combo like Thielen and Jefferson, I mean, they've only played together for half a season. So, we're not totally confident that the combined ceiling we've seen for them to date is, their actual true ceiling. But, I don't know. I think it's a little dangerous to try to project, what, future values that we've never seen before. So you figure if Thielen and Jefferson reach their combined ceiling, it's probably like a 90th to 95th percentile outcome for Cousins. So we calculate ceiling as the combined ceiling of the receivers plus the 95th percentile historic outcome of a quarterback, Cousins. Add that all up. I really think the ceiling DKP per dollar is super valuable. Just like, you can see kind of the stars I've put next to some of these stacks. And, they tend to be the stacks that just have the highest ceiling per dollar. And I think that metric is a decent catch-all for just like the distribution of, players. We have, some players who have, like, I think Derek Carr might be a good example, who, always has a pretty good median projection, but leaves a bit to be desired in terms of his, true ceiling. So it's a good catch-all of just kind of what's the upside, what's kind of the high-end outcome, not only of a single players within kind of a set of players, but really what's the high-end outcome for a combination or pair of players. And it also, I think, captures just the correlative properties. Receivers that have better positive correlation, their combined ceiling is likely to be closer to the sum of the individual ceilings of players that are within that pair. So, like, we saw Julio Ridley, I think, had a combined ceiling of like 64. I mean, that's it's still pretty high. I mean, that's like 90%, I think, of the sum of individual ceilings for, Julio and Ridley. I think those guys have the benefit of having played a lot together, relatively speaking. So, they've had a lot of opportunities to put together kind of high combined ceiling outcomes. But yeah, I think that's like a good kind of catch-all metric that I usually pay attention to a lot.
Yeah, and I think the examples that you had is good to dovetail us into a question that I've got a lot. I've seen it debated, this idea of correlation relative to contest size. And there's this idea that, correlation opens us up for more variance. You assume to win these tournaments, we want to take on more variance. But on the other side, we'll look at a winning Millie Maker lineup. The winner of the play action last week had zero correlation in his entire lineup. He hit the 9-leg parlay for $100,000 because in that field size, you have to get every individual thing right. Whereas if I'm playing in a 250 person tournament, I can pay the combined cost for both Thielen and Jefferson. And if one of them gets 40 and one of them gets 10, I'm completely okay with that cost proposition. So how do you think about correlation relative to contest size? Because I think it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't looked at kind of past contest data to develop some sort of empirical, I guess, hypothesis on it. But I mean, I do think you can just kind of think it through. And to me, there's a pretty clear answer. Like, so you think each given week, right, there is some hypothetical optimal lineup, not what lineup won the Millie, or what lineup that someone put together was the highest scoring, but like, hindsight, if we could go back and what is the optimal combination of players that scored the most fantasy points on a retrospective slate, it probably is going to be some 9-leg parlay, or like a single stack 8-leg parlay, because like we discussed, like going back to the Julio Ridley example, those guys in conjunction with one another are unable to really achieve their maximum personal ceilings. They're only able to achieve, some combined ceiling that is like 90 to 95% of their, some of their individual ceilings. That's just like a correlated lineup where, particularly when you get into receiver plus receiver, you are, naturally, I think, lowering the ceiling of your performance. When you have two guys who, have outcomes that can occur that, cannibalize one another's fantasy opportunity, you're naturally, limiting your true ceiling. And to win a Millie Maker play action type tournament, which, isn't one that I like play really ever, so I don't have like a great sense of, what kind of the optimal strategy is or what strategies have worked for me. But like, you think about it, to win a play action, which I think is what, like 200,000 or something entries, six figures in entries. You need a 99 to 100% of kind of the optimal total to win a 200 person or even 1,000 or even 200, 2,000 person tournament. You don't really need like the 99% of the optimal or 100% of the optimal. You might, someone might throw in a uncorrelated lineup and just hit the nuts, but like, it's pretty unlikely. What's more likely is that the winning lineup is 95% or 93% or 97% of kind of the combined optimal. And when you acknowledge that you don't need to get to 100%, you just need to get to 95% of, the optimal combination of players. Now, all of a sudden you're like, all right, well, I'm less concerned about losing that upper 5%. And I'm really focused on, okay, what's going to give me the highest chance of getting to 95% of the optimal? And, when you reduce the number of degrees of freedom to, 6 or 7 or 8, like naturally you're going to give yourself a better chance. Like, I mean, let's just assume like every single player has, 50% chance of hitting some useful ceiling. And obviously it's not that, it's, 5% chance or whatever, but even if it is 50, the function for the probability of you putting together a 9-leg parlay that hits all of those 50%, is 2 to the power of 9. If you look at 2 to the power of 9 compared to 2 to the power of 7 or 6, I mean, it's like exponentially lower likelihood, 2 to the power of 9 versus like, 2 to the power of 6. And then when you actually acknowledge that it's not a 50% chance, it's like a 5 or 10% chance. I mean, you're really doing yourself a favor where you are trading that upper kind of 5% of what's possible for 5% in terms of your score relative to the true optimal. You're willing to trade that upper 5% for increased likelihood of reaching that 95th percentile of kind of combined outcome, by twofold, or I don't know what exactly kind of you're increasing it by, but
yeah, no, that's super interesting. I can feel people now. They want to start applying some of these concepts we're talking about here. Let's start getting a little bit more specific. One that I think trips people up a lot is how running backs factor into these correlations. I think most people understand the intuitive correlative properties of quarterback to pass catchers, but we have Pat's here saying how much changes when thinking about running back wide receiver correlations, get scared about playing them together. I got a question earlier about AJ Brown and Derrick Henry together. We saw both of them have good games last week. How should we be thinking about running back wide receiver correlations?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two, I think, to me, like key ways in which correlations come to fruition. The most natural one that we're very familiar with quarterbacks and receivers is that there are plays that occur that mutually benefit multiple players, like pass catchers and pass throwers. But I think there are other factors that contribute to correlation. I think game script is like a big one. I mean, I was looking this morning at just like Cup and Woods, right? These are guys who pretty much all plays short of, maybe Woods throwing it to Cup. Like there are a few plays that mutually benefit them. However, and so it's an interesting one. They have very different correlation, 2020 versus 2019. Because, or at least my hypothesis is that, game script can tend to kind of produce correlative outcomes where, the Rams are like, when they're ahead, they're super run heavy. So even outcomes that don't include any of Cup or Woods, when Aaron Donald, gets a strip sack return for a touchdown, that's an outcome that Cup and Woods don't score any points on that. However, that outcome adversely affects them in the same way, in a correlative way. Conversely, when Goff throws a pick six, even though none of those that play doesn't involve or allow points for Woods or Cup at all, what it does is it shifts the environment of the game in a way that stands to benefit in the case of Goff throwing a pick six, penalize in the case of Donald returning a sack for a touchdown. I guess game flow in favor of Cup and Woods. So if you like filter, so see how on the second date you have 2020-12-04.
Yeah.
Just put that to 2021-4. So just we're looking at the really 2018 through and then could you do 2019-9-6? So just looking at pretty much the 2019 season. Great. They have this like neutral, slightly negative correlation. You can see that these games that Cup had a great game, Woods, was pretty underwhelming. We have instances where Cup scored close to 30 points, and like one of those games, Woods scored 30. One of those games, he scored 10. Right? These are kind of, we even look at Cup like when he scored 20 points. We have an instance where Woods scored 7, but then one time where Woods scored 30 plus. Like these are properties that are indicative of just kind of neutral to no correlation. The outcome of one player gives us little confidence one way or the other in the outcome of another. Now, if you change the date range to 2020-9-6 to 2021-1-4, so essentially just no worries.
2020?
Yes, 2020-9-6 to 2021. So just looking at the 2020 season, this is a year in which the Rams have been, I think, one of the more notably kind of game flow dependent offenses where, these games that Cup and Woods blow up together, it's not because, Woods is throwing the ball to Cup or whatever. It's because the game, and if you hover over the dots, I'm curious to just see, so that was, a close win in overtime against Tampa Bay. I'm looking at the bottom two rows of that little box, right? So that was that Tampa Bay game. Right, loss. The one at the bottom. If you go to the one, the one at the bottom of kind of that high trio. So where Cup had like 30, loss. Right. So like this is an example of how game flow and game script can cause players to correlate who we wouldn't think of being natural correlates because they don't have these outcomes that positively affect both players, directly, but they have outcomes in a team that is highly responsive in their strategy to, outcomes of the opponent. Is if the other team's beating them, they're going to be super run heavy, and both Cup and Woods are likely to fail. if the Rams are losing, they, switch to a fairly pass happy oriented offense. And you have an elevated likelihood of Kupp and Woods succeeding. I mean, the run out so far this year has been kind of perfect for how, proving this example. But I think also the splits on the Seattle receivers, 2019 versus 2020 are pretty drastic. Metcalf and Lockett had, positive correlation in 2019 when Seattle was this, Pete Carroll was like, when they're winning, like, we're just going to run the ball. And, when we're losing, we're going to air it out with, one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And now all of a sudden we're in 2020, let Russ cook season. And we're seeing super negative correlation between these guys because whether or not Seattle's losing or winning doesn't seem to have a huge impact on how the team scripts and plans. And yeah, I mean, I was getting blown up, not by people, but just like I was trying to stack Lockett and Metcalf at the beginning of the season, just being like, this is great. Like, two of the best receivers in the league, best quarterback in the league, positive correlates from 2019. And quickly over the course of the year, I didn't adjust quick enough, but I was seeing like, all right, well, this is kind of a different team, and the way they are scheming and running their offense is, affecting how these two guys relate to one another. It also didn't help that, all of a sudden Metcalf costs, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000. So
this one is hilarious too, right? Because it shows it as this outlier where you would have gotten your money's worth paying for both of them, and you get 4.3, I believe, from Metcalf, and this was the 56-point game from Lockett.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of where the combined total you could poke holes in it. That there are instances where the combined ceiling of two players is really just a massive ceiling by one player and a somewhat pedestrian game for the other. And we've seen a lot of that this year from these two guys. So anyways, going back to your question though about running backs, obviously, James White and Cam Newton are going to have decent correlation because like James White, when he has a big game, so they're going to have a small sample. But if we looked back, in the past to 8 games, it's not that small actually, but I think the correlation would probably be higher with Brady. That's an example of like, obviously James White and the quarterback correlate because he's a pass catcher. You probably would have to dial that back though to 2018 just because they haven't played any games together this year. But in the instance of Derrick Henry, so he's been an interesting one where Derrick Henry actually has positive correlation with Tannehill, and I think it's less clear. Like we know that Derrick Henry isn't a big pass catcher. Yeah, so like through 31 games, 0.31, like that's an insanely positive correlation for a running back and quarterback, which is a pair we typically don't think of. But that's why, like, you see why it's important to think about correlation not as like, oh, well, all running backs correlate with all quarterbacks this way, that, certain running backs correlate with certain quarterbacks. So I think the thing with Derrick Henry is like this notion that he is because he doesn't catch passes, he, is like a clock kind of grinder and just like takes away opportunities from other people, I think is, incorrect. Like Derrick Henry in his ceiling performances is breaking off, 60, 80-yard runs where the other team just gets the ball back immediately. I think Derrick Henry also has such a prominent, red zone and green zone role where games in which Tannehill succeeds, aka games where he's able to push the ball downfield, Tennessee is, at least in the last year and a half, has been fairly condensed where like when, AJ Brown is kind of clearly their number one receiver especially in terms of like moving the ball downfield. I think Jonnu is a great red zone receiver, but like Jonnu doesn't help move the ball downfield. So like, Brown, Davis, even to a lesser extent, these are guys that receivers, and of course Tannehill, who are moving the ball downfield. And when they succeed, they are putting Henry in a position to, score fantasy points. When they succeed, they get him to the red zone. And, he's accounting for, I don't know what it is, but, probably some large chunk of, team's points. I mean, Tannehill is somewhat of a rushing quarterback. Like it's not that uncommon to see him rush for, a 12-yard touchdown. And, typically like a guy like Josh Allen, I think probably has negative correlation with say like Devin Singletary, but, Derrick Henry, he's able to rip off these big runs where like, okay, if Derrick Henry rushes from the his own 40-yard line to the opponent's 10, and then that sets up a Tannehill scramble, sure, Tannehill took a touchdown from Henry, or, maybe Henry, by ripping off a 60-yard run, took away potential passing yards for Tannehill. But these also, like, these guys speed up the game and just put each other in a position to score these high value touchdowns at kind of an elevated rate. So I think that's an interesting combination.
Yeah, and that's as I continue to try to untangle this in my head, it's like this thing where AJ Brown and Ryan Tannehill on a per play level are positively correlated. If AJ Brown catches a pass, it's going to be from Ryan Tannehill. Derrick Henry's going to be directly negatively correlated on a per play level because he's not touching the ball when that pass occurs. But on a game level, they could be very positively correlated. Like you said, Derrick Henry rips off an 80-yard touchdown. Other team gets a ball back. We're now in a shootout here, and that rising tide lifts all boats. So I think that's the thing that's maybe trippy for this running back idea, is the per play and like per game correlations.
When you think about correlation only in the direct, player X threw the ball to player Y, 20 yards, right? And 25 yards, because fractions are tough. Like, great. 1 point for the quarterback, 3.5 points for the receiver, right? Everyone wins. But what you lose in that are these plays that aren't mutually beneficial, but, in the direct, but they're mutually beneficial indirectly from like a game flow standpoint. So I think that's, something to pay attention to. And, stuff like that doesn't really show through when you're looking, because, most quarterbacks negatively correlate with their running backs, but there are instances, sets of players where there's kind of this weird counterfactual trend. And, and look, maybe, I don't know, I have pretty good confidence in like Tannehill to Henry correlation. They've been playing together for long enough, but, maybe their true correlation is 0 and they've just been running really hot for the last year and a half. It's like, we never have true certainty in these numbers, and, roles change from season to season or even within the season. So,
when we look at, how do you decide the three guys? Obviously it's the quarterback generally, with 2 pass catchers here for the stack, but how would a guy like, Derrick Henry crack the Tennessee one? Or how do you think about it if there's like 2 very similar wide receivers, say, maybe we're saying MVS instead of Lazard? How do you think about these specific stack combinations?
So I typically go with just the 2 most expensive pass catchers, and that's usually wide receiver or tight end. But in the instance of like Nyheim Hines, where he is functioning as a, pass catching running back, I'll kind of make exceptions for some of these guys. Kamara, I've done it in the past. James White, I think I did it this week. I mean, that's one of those things where, like, look, I obviously could type it up, but like, it takes some time.
You got to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah, right. Like, and that's the point. I think the Substack is supposed to be kind of a sample of our tools, but the tool is there where anyone who wants to can look up the correlation of really any player, so long as they've played in a couple games together. So I think like we can stick on Tennessee, like naturally from kind of, they're both receivers, like Tannehill, Brown, Davis is the stack that makes the most sense, if you're just like looking at pass catchers. But if you pull up Brown and Davis, like they actually have negative correlations such that, I actually, the price makes it really tough this week to go like Tannehill, Henry plus Brown. But, like Derrick Henry has better correlative properties with Brown than Davis does. So even though, it kind of goes against what we think is normal for like a stack, based on correlation, I might be more inclined to go, Henry plus receiver plus Tannehill. I think, a column I try to look at and, with this stuff is like, all right, is this a team we want to double stack or single stack? And, I kind of try to look at the difference between the average double correlation column and average single correlation column. So, as we discussed at the top of the show, correlation is between 2 two vectors or a pair of players. So there's really no good way to calculate what is the correlation between three players. The way I try to address it is what I call triangular correlation. It's, we have three players, Tannehill, Brown, Davis. What is the average correlation between all combinations of those three? So, right, Tannehill plus Brown, Tannehill plus Davis, Davis plus Brown. And then the average single correlation is just the average correlation between Tannehill, average correlation between Brown. Now we have some instances. I would guess Tennessee is probably a good one. I'm trying to find them.
Oh, sorry. I just sorted by average double correlation. They're down here in the 14th row now.
Got it. Yeah, right. So Tennessee, like they have, this pretty good single correlation where kind of the average between Tannehill and Brown or Tannehill and Davis, is this 0.32. But when we consider the notion of combining Brown plus Davis, add their correlation to this average mix, you see the correlation drop off a good bit. That is going to be the case for 90% of teams. There are a few teams where like the correlation between two receivers is better than the average correlation between each receiver and his quarterback. But there are instances like I'm looking at I think Arizona was one I kind of tabbed as a spot where like I'm just not interested in double stacking Arizona this week. So they're at the bottom. Hopkins and Murray, you would think like, alpha receiver and his quarterback would have good positive correlation. Like so far this year, they've had super neutral correlation, but Kirk and Hopkins in particular have had super bad. I think it's like negative 0.5 something correlation. Like that is a double stack that because of that negative correlation between receivers doesn't mean like they can't both get there, but I think you're just going up against pretty long odds for them to get there together. I think it's a stack that makes more sense to pick one of Hopkins or Kirk and not try to force Hopkins and Kirk together, because so far this year they haven't shown the ability to go off together kind of in the same game.
So I
that's
want
something I'm kind of looking at.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I have one other kind of more macro concept question I want to do, and then I think we can wrap up with maybe trying to pick one of these trickier spots and then maybe using the tool to help inform us building a stack that makes sense. But the question I had, and Eric Belair had asked this, and it's about this idea of bringbacks. And, it's pretty common. Everyone knows, the single or the double stack, and you bring it back with one player from the other team. I think intuitively it makes sense, but we've seen some situations, the Jets really come to mind as this team who's giving up a lot of production to opposing offenses, but the bringbacks haven't quite been getting there in the way that can really win you tournaments. So how do you think about bringbacks, both from kind of like a macrative correlation standpoint and maybe with specific outliers like this Jets team that doesn't appear to be trying to win football games?
Yeah, so I guess for me, I'm less, first of all, price is a big thing. Like the Jets bring back, even though we know they can't put up a lot of points, their receivers have been so cheap, particularly Mims and Perriman, such that, even if they have a super low total, it's a little more manageable to bring them back. But that's, one thing I'm looking at is just like, what's the total of the other side, the bad side, right? The side we don't want to stack, team, but we might, the bring back side, right? If it's a pretty cheap side, I think it's more manageable. If they have a super low total and it's an expensive side, so like I've kind of avoided playing Crowder as a Jets bring back because, for him to pay off at his price point, like the Jets would need to achieve some total that's above and beyond like what's projected by Vegas. So that's something I'm looking at. I really think correlatively, like I'm less interested in what the correlative properties are of the Jets and more interested in the correlative properties of the team that we're stacking. So in our correlation app tool, and if you could kick it over to me, I could kind of walk us through it. We have a feature where you can look at correlation of a player against the opposing offense as a whole by typing in OPPT offense. Or you could look at so I like going to offense So that is the correlation of Russ versus the combined fantasy points of the entire opposition's offense. So, as we can see, like no player obviously puts up 100 fantasy points, but offenses as a whole, against Seattle put up, these range of points. And you can see so correlation is never causal. Like we don't have really the ability to say, although like with some relationships, we probably have a hunch that like the offense performing well, and I'm looking back to 2018 kind of even. So this is when kind of they were in, don't let Russ cook unless we need him to cook mode. We can make the assumption that like when opposing offenses put up a bunch of fantasy points that force Russ to, be more pass oriented, force the Seahawks to be more pass oriented. So we see like this good positive correlation. So you could look at opposing offense. You could also look at like opposing running backs, for example. But I do think it's a little tricky looking at specific positions. Running back and quarterback are one of the more trustworthy ones. But like, when you're looking at opposing receivers, well, like, okay, what if Russ played the Chiefs and like Travis Kelce had a huge game and, Ty Hill and Watkins were quiet, but, Mahomes and Kelce had a big game. Like, so you can get stuff kind of messed up, I think, when you try to focus too narrowly on position. But like running back, there's, I think, less variance into how, heavily teams lean on running backs aside from some of these outliers that are super like run heavy, whatever. But
can you do Mahomes? Because I think, the Chiefs have been one of these teams that seem to put up points in any instance. But the bringbacks sometimes have been tricky there.
Sure. So like Mahomes has this negative, and so the plot is always going to look at the first guy in the list. So it's plotting Wilson. So I got to go Mahomes. We can see that in Mahomes' best game, some of his best games, like that's opposing running backs. We can see that. Okay, so he's probably got positive correlation, it looks like, but it's still to a lesser degree than Russ. Like Russ has this big 0.45 correlation that's more than twice that of Mahomes. It is a side that when you're stacking the Chiefs, because there is this more neutral correlation, like we can be a little more team specific. I think like an interesting one is like back when Lamar Jackson was really good, he had this negative correlation with the opponent where and that kind of fit the narrative, right? That like Lamar and the Ravens were really good when they're playing from ahead. So, these games where Lamar's in the 30s, the Ravens, and they had a good defense. So like they're just not giving up opposing fantasy points a whole lot. But like when Lamar is having a great game, like they're definitely not giving up fantasy points. I think an interesting one I'm thinking about this week is like Fitzpatrick has had, somewhat weird correlation. I mean, if we remove this data point and you try to draw, a straight line between, let's see if I can get this right. There's cool features in like these, I don't know. Anyways, if we try to draw a straight line between these data points that I have boxed, like for the most part, that line would just go like kind of straight down, right? So like games in which Fitzpatrick does super well, I don't think we necessarily need to bring back someone on the other side. So that's, an interesting example this week, right? Miami, if Fitzpatrick starts, has this super high spread where we're like, oh, I don't know if I want to play Fitzpatrick because I'm worried that Cincinnati's not going to be able to do anything. And because quarterbacks, only pass when they're pass a lot when they're behind, I'm worried that if Cincinnati does poorly, Fitzpatrick can't get there. Well, like, I don't know. Data would suggest that Fitzpatrick's capable of 30 plus fantasy points, even when the opposition is, not putting up huge totals. And actually, when Fitzpatrick does terribly, the opponent is actually kind of getting there in a big way, versus a guy like Russ. And so we have him with Tampa just because it splits by team. So he's actually been a little more negative with Miami. So yeah, like Russ versus Fitzpatrick this week. Really, both teams with like high totals, relatively speaking. Not the highest, but pretty good. Russ is a guy that, because of that positive correlation, and especially I think I discussed with Blender, like we are kind of suspecting that maybe Seattle is going back a little bit towards their run-heavy game script dependent tendencies, that I have less confidence in Russ really having a big game unless the opposition is having a good game as well. Fitzpatrick, on the other hand, I feel like has a better chance of getting there, even if the opposition fails massively. And, for that reason, doesn't mean like, don't play Russ and only play Fitzpatrick. It just means that with Fitzpatrick, we might be a little more comfortable in, going Fitz, Parker, Gesicki, which is a really correlative stack. Like Gesicki and Parker for 2 pass catchers have exceptional correlation, and both have exceptional correlation with Fitzpatrick. I would feel okay going those 3 guys, no Cincinnati guys. I mean, I happen to just like the Cincinnati, like Higgins, Boyd, and AJ Green are all pretty cheap this week. So like, I don't think like, never play an opposition with Fitzpatrick, but we should be okay, I think, with not running back anyone with Fitzpatrick as we're with Russ. If you buy that it's truly kind of still let Russ cook, maybe like I'd be interested to just see what his correlation with opponents is. Still super high. So, I don't know. It does kind of feel like if I'm playing, Russ Metcalf or Russ Lockett, and Russ has a big game, it seems like likely that you want someone on the other side.
Yeah, you need the forces on the other side to really push him to that ceiling game. That's super cool. I want to get this up on its feet in practice here. And I'm just going to throw out a stack situation that I think is an interesting spot this week. And then we can, use the tool to build it out. I got a lineup up here. We'll put this in the play action. We'll try to win a lotto with our correlative lineup and really thumb our nose at the lotto players. But I want to talk about the Bears this week because we have Mitch Trubisky getting the start. We have David Montgomery, who's cheap and projecting well and is going to be popular. Allen Robinson's going to catch a decent amount of ownership. No one needs to be sold on Allen Robinson. And then we have a few other interesting situations with the secondary pieces. I think Darnell Mooney is interesting. We have Cole Kmet now, who has kind of passed Jimmy Graham as the main tight end there based on last week's data. And he's really cheap as well. So if I threw that stack at you and we are starting to consider, hey, can I use David Montgomery in a stack here? Or do we want to go to these ancillary pass catchers? How would we start figuring out how to build our Bears stack?
Yeah, so the Bears are kind of tough this year from a correlation tool standpoint because they've split quarterbacks. So if we just filter on to 2020, and I know there's a game in there with Tarek Cohen, a few games up there up top, but like, if we look at his correlation with Trubisky, we only have a 5-game sample is positive. If we look at Foles as well, because Foles has played a few games, we got negative correlation with Foles. So, I mean, maybe, you make the case that, hey, Trubisky playing is a good thing for Montgomery, that, they positively correlate, even though it's a small sample. I wouldn't say that they like have great positive correlation, but I think based on the samples we have, you can make the case that they're better correlates than Foles and Montgomery. So the thing I was looking at this week, because I think this is a kind of a way I try to start building lineups, is thinking about who are some of the key like leverage pieces and what I want to do with them, and how either I want to gain leverage against them or try to think about ways to be like, all right, I want Montgomery, and then to be different from all the people that just have Montgomery, I want an extra piece. You mentioned Allen Robinson. Like I was looking at him, like these are just 2 guys that we this is 2020, but if we take kind of the longer form on these 2 guys, I think we don't really want to consider lineups that have both Montgomery and Allen Robinson. I mean, there's the ownership piece, which you mentioned, if those are likely to be the 2 most popular guys, taking on both of them doesn't seem to differentiate us that much. We have this negative correlation. Like if we remove this data point, curious to see, so that's 20, that's like this most recent week. So if we go like to 11/24, yeah, I mean, look at how, like, just if we remove, and so that's, one thing to note about correlation is the value tends to be upweighted or downweighted by outlier outcomes. you know, we're not talking about leverage from like a DFS ownership standpoint, but you know, mathematically, like leverage is a metric that's used to describe how distant data points are from like the relative center. So anyways, like high leverage data points tend to shape you know, correlation, or like linear regression is a popular kind of regression technique that is correlation based. Anyways, no need to go there. So if we remove, you know, just last week in which Robinson and Montgomery both had really great games, that was that prime time, either Monday or Thursday or Sunday, I forget. Like these guys have had really negative correlation. So I do think, you know, if you are hand building, you know, you want to say, choose one of those guys, or if you're building an optimizers, I think like a really good rule to have would just be like max one of Montgomery Robinson. Like, sure, there are ways that, you know, it's not impossible for them to both get there, but it's pretty long odds. I mean, you know, in games which Montgomery has gone over 20 points, like Robinson just hasn't gotten there. And in games which Robinson has had great games, you know, Montgomery hasn't gotten there. So, you know, I think if you, yeah, so anyways, I mentioned that rule, and like I think Robinson is a great, you know, if Montgomery is going to be super chalky, like Robinson is a great leverage piece, because, you know, for you to succeed by not and not having Montgomery, right? Montgomery needs to fail, and the data would suggest that when Montgomery fails, it actually, you know, has a really or a much higher likelihood of Robinson succeeding. So like you really kind of double up in your benefit there by having Robinson instead of Montgomery. So if the stack you were kind of thinking of was the route through the passing attack, you know, I think going Robinson, would be a good way to go.
And so now what if I said to you, I want to get another guy in this double stack, and I'm looking at either Darnell Mooney or punting it off at tight end with Cole Kmet. I know the sample size on Kmet is going to be super small. He's also really, really cheap, so maybe the correlation doesn't come into play as much, but how would you help me make heads or tails of that decision?
Yeah, like you said, the sample size with Kmet is super small. Anthony Miller has good positive correlation, but in 2018 and 19, I think his role was drastically different from what it's been this year. So yeah, I mean, I would take a look at how guys correlate with Robinson. It's tough. The Bears team, like I said, is really tough because they have had kind of changing roles throughout the season. You know, the data would suggest that Mooney has pretty neutral correlation with Robinson. Miller positive. Kind of just interested to see what that looks like from a plot standpoint. Yeah, so it seems like, yeah, and I think I'd also just like want to look at how Miller, Darnell Mooney, Kmet correlate. Now that we've kind of sussed out how they correlate with Robinson, maybe how they correlate with Trubisky and Montgomery. You know, we would want to upweight guys who positively correlate with Trubisky and negatively correlate with Montgomery. So yeah, they both have. I mean, God, Chicago is super messy this year because they have had guys moving in and out.
And the Kmet thing, it's tough. I mean, this was his first game where he kind of operated as the tight end one. So let's. I know I threw us a curveball. I'm going to keep moving us along here, though. Let's put in Kmet. I think he's an interesting play just because Akins in that punt range is going to be really popular. So we get the correlation, we get rid of tight end, we do it cheaply, and then the big question now would be, do we bring it back here? Oh, I got to get my side on the screen. Do we bring it back with a Detroit Lion? You know, it's tricky because we don't want to run a double tight end. So that kind of takes Hawkinson off the board. It probably funnels us to Marvin Jones or just not bringing it back. How would you think about that in this case?
Yeah. So looking like, and I'm going to go back to 2018 because Robinson and so now I think we've established that, like, sure, we have Kmet, but like the core pieces here are Robinson and Trubisky. And we really kind of want to key off of our most prominent pieces, which tends to be quarterback, I think, is kind of key one. And then, our best receiver or tight end, if, you're going Kelsey or Waller, is kind of key two. So, Trubisky has positive 0.33 correlation over 33 games dating back to 2018 with opposing offenses. Robinson, negative 0.125, so somewhat neutral. I mean, I think one thing about this game is it is really not like neither of these teams have exceptionally high totals. So but they're not like low, right? You're kind of just building this lineup saying like, I can see that neither of these totals are super high, but if the game just goes massively over, right, I want to stand to benefit from that. So, I think because the game is kind of tight enough from a spread standpoint, and also, these guys are cheap and somewhat low total teams, we really do need this game to go massively over in order to succeed. And I really think the only way it does go massively over is if both teams are really pushing it. So, I mean, between kind of positive correlation with Trubisky and opposing offenses and, like I said, that need for the game to just go massively over in order for this lineup to work, I think we definitely have to bring back, at least one guy on the opposition. And then I think there's an element of trying to figure out who that guy is. So, Jones is going to be tough because he's been wide receiver too. So, this is an example where, like, even though Galladay's not playing, I think Marvin Jones' role this week is going to be more similar to Kenny Galladay's role over the past 2 years than it has been to his own role over the past 2 years. Does that kind of make sense and kind of follow? So,
you don't want to look at his correlation in the wide receiver 2 role. You want to look at it in the wide receiver 1 role.
Right, exactly. So, I can plug, I'll plug Marvin Jones in there just, for good measure. And then I'll plug in opposing offense. We can also look at opposing QB. I think that's just like, good one to key off of and sort. So like, all these guys have neutral to maybe slightly positive correlation with the opponent. So Marvin Jones, kind of wide receiver 2, Marvin Jones actually has the best correlation with the opponent. And then kind of Hawkinson and Galladay in between. So I don't know. The correlation is not giving us a great sense of kind of who we would need on the other side. I mean, we could also look at, I'm not sure if DeAndre Swift is, I think he's like got cleared to play, but hasn't been practicing. Is that right?
I don't think he's going to play.
He seems unlikely. Okay. Well, he's got negative correlation anyways. So, maybe even if he does, we say, well, okay, I don't want to play DeAndre Swift. I got to go, Hawkinson or Jones. I mean, if I was building I'm sorry. Well, you wouldn't really play Hawkinson, right? Because if we're playing Komet, like I don't. So that one kind of answers itself. But I do think, looking at how guys, if we're considering kind of a set of players to bring back and decide who we want on the bring back, looking at how players correlate with how those bring back options correlate with the opponent is valuable. Or if like they're two different positions, like let's say we were truly between like Swift and Jones, we might go like, okay, how does Trubisky correlate with opposing running backs versus opposing wide receivers, and say like, oh wow, Trubisky has this great correlation with opposing receivers, not so much running backs. So even though Swift is kind of this pass catching running back, I'm still going to show more favoritism towards wide receiver. I mean, I think looking at tight ends is somewhat useless just because teams manage their tight ends like so differently just based on who their tight end is. So, I don't know if there's much to be kind of gained there.
Yeah. Well, I think, in fashion of this show, as Blender would say, you can just fill out this lineup with whoever you want, play whoever you want after this. But I just wanted to start us off here with a lineup to just kind of think about how we would think about these trickier situations. And I think there's some cleaner situations this week. Like you mentioned, we see Woods and Cup. They're both really cheaply priced. Strong correlation this year, pretty clean stack. So have some fun messing around with the advanced sports analytics tool. They have the app here. I get the Substack in my inbox each week. You'll get this table here from Stewart. Anything else I'm missing from people? I can tell they are excited to check out the tools you guys have going on over there.
Yeah, I mean, we focus mostly on the correlation today, but we have kind of a traditional projection system. The Substack, I tend to include some plots on like usage trends, and that we have this volume efficiency tool that allows you to kind of chart trends over time. So I was looking at it last night, and was just one thing I think that jumped out to me as being interesting was how the target share of both Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams is trending down while Robert Tonyan is trending up. I don't know if that's just noise or if the Packers and Rodgers are like actively kind of scheming away from their running backs now that what's his name, Lazard has returned from injury. But it's I think it's just a useful tool where you can kind of visualize and see like how different usage metrics trend. So you can see here how like Jones and Williams are trending down, and really Tanyan's been on the upswing over the past 4 weeks. So stuff like that available on the site to hopefully kind of supplement your lineup building around kind of the traditional projection system. So feel free to check it out, guys, if that makes sense for you.
Yeah, someone was asking, is the Substack for this week out yet? I hadn't seen it in my inbox. I'm probably holding you up from it.
Yeah, right now. No, you're exactly right. I'm going to work on it after this. And maybe I can like open up access to the correlation tool for, the rest of the day or whatever, if people who are not ASA subscribers but have kind of been interested in what we've been shown in this stream want to check it out. I'm happy to open that up and, let people poke around with that for the next day or two before Sunday.
Yeah, I'll also put it in the show notes and get it out on Twitter as well. If he is going to open that up for you guys to mess around with it, that would be super cool. Appreciate you guys coming out. I know sometimes, my goal with these shows is to do more evergreen stuff. I see some people in there that, they want the picks and plays. I'm going to say this in the nicest way possible. There are a million other shows you can go watch if you want someone to give you the plays of the week. That's not what we do here. I like to bring on smart people. I like to get better at DFS in ways that we can apply it week after week after week. So that is what we did. And I really appreciate Stewart coming on. You guys can follow him on Twitter at Start Gibson, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Just created a Twitter this year. This first year I've had Twitter. So we need to boost Stewart's followers. He is, the phrase gets bandied about maybe a little too loosely. I will say it in this case. He is criminally under-followed. You guys will need to check him out on Twitter. I tweeted out his handle for this show, and we'll get it out there. So please follow Stewart, doing great work at Advanced Sports Analytics. You guys can catch him weekly with Blender as well, one of my favorite shows on the RotoGrinders network. Please subscribe to the channels if you have not done so yet. We appreciate you. We will be back on Monday for our DFS lineup review. Let's keep the good times rolling, guys. We'll see you next week.